The story starts in Texas, where a collection of enslaved black individuals are walking through the Texas desert, led by the brothers Ace and Dickie in a wagon. This is happening 2 years prior to the Civil War in 1858, and one of the enslaved individuals, Django, has been separated from his wife Broomhilda von Schaft after being sold. Their journey is interrupted in the night by Dr. King Schultz, a former German dentist now working as a bounty hunter, who approaches them in the darkness. Ace becomes angry and demands to know why Schultz is there, threatening him. Schultz calms Ace by explaining that he is a traveler looking for the Speck brothers, known slave traders. Schultz is interested in buying Django for his information about the outlaw Brittle brothers, who he believes the Speck brothers may have bought at a previous auction in Greenville. Schultz asks the enslaved group if anyone has ties to the Carucan plantation, as he wishes to purchase Django. After Django speaks up, Schultz uses a kerosene lamp to identify him among the group. Later, he inquires if Django has any details on the Brittle brothers, so Django lists their names as Big John, Ellis, and Roger, sometimes referred to as Little Raj. Django then goes on to describe them as former overseers at the Carucan plantation under his previous owner. However, Schultz interrupts him, explaining that the Brittle brothers are no longer overseeing. He then questions if Django would be able to identify them if they cross paths again. Unexpectedly, Ace interjects, cautioning Schultz against speaking to Django in that manner. Schultz attempts to calm him down, portraying himself as a mere businessman looking to make a deal. Despite this, Ace refuses to sell Django and eventually points his gun at Schultz after his request is denied. Schultz taunts Ace, questioning if his actions are simply for show or if he aims to harm him intentionally. With no other option, Schultz swiftly shoots Ace in the head and Dickie's horse after being threatened by Ace. As a result, Dickie is trapped beneath the weight of the deceased horse. Schultz then approaches Dickie, facetiously apologizing for shooting the horse. He urges Dickie not to act hastily and allows him a moment to collect himself. Despite Dickie's evident frustration, Schultz remains composed and encourages him to lower his protests to a minimum, as he still intends to continue his conversation with Django. Schultz returns to talk with Django, urging Dickie to pay a reasonable amount when he learns that Django can still identify the Brittle brothers. Regrettably, Schultz abandons the other enslaved individuals, leaving them to deal with Dickie on their own while Django takes Ace's coat and horse. The next day, Django and Schultz reach Daughtry, Texas, attracting attention as Django, the first black man seen riding a horse, enters. Luckily, they acquire ownership of a bar restaurant when the innkeeper flees upon seeing Django with Schultz. Schultz then reveals his new career plan as a bounty hunter who trades in bodies rather than lives for profit, transporting deceased enslaved individuals for rewards. Despite his disdain for slavery, Schultz enlists Django's help, proposing to use their situation to their advantage. Reluctantly, Schultz agrees to Django's plan to kill the Brittle brothers in exchange for Django gaining freedom and $75. As their journey begins, Schultz discovers that Django is married, learning of his intention to reunite with his wife and secure her freedom. Django explains that Broomhilda was raised by a German family and speaks some German, serving as a house slave for the von Schafts. They move forward to Tennessee, preparing to infiltrate a plantation using Django's assumed role as a valet. Schultz allows Django to pick any outfit he wants. They then head to the plantation to meet with Spencer Big Daddy Bennett and by one of his enslaved individuals. Luckily, Big Daddy agrees, so Schultz seizes the chance to instruct his servant to show Django around his impressive plantation. While being shown around by Bettina, Django inquires about the Brittle brothers. Bettina responds negatively, suggesting that they might be using different names. Thankfully, Bettina mentions the Schaefers who had previously visited Big Daddy's plantation. Unbeknownst to Bettina, she divulges the whereabouts of the three brothers. Ellis Brittle is in the field, while the other two are at the stable punishing little Jody for a mishap. Django immediately rushes to confront the two Brittle brothers and tells Bettina to bring Schultz there. After reprimanding little Jody, Django swiftly kills John and continues to assault little Raj. Upon Schultz's arrival at the stable, Django informs him of the two Brittles he dispatched. Identifying Ellis on the run, Schultz takes the shot without hesitation. Later that night, Big Daddy tries to apprehend Django and Schultz with a group of men, despite allowing them to depart earlier following the apprehension of the Brittles. Unfortunately, they fail to convince Big Daddy of the consequences of using deadly force against a court officer performing his duties, which could result in hanging. Forced into a corner, Schultz surprises the group with explosives hidden in his wagon. Luckily, Schultz hits the mark, causing chaos, and hands over the sniper rifle to Django to target Big Daddy. Later that night, Django and Schultz relax and share a meal, leading Django to open up about his missing wife. Schultz then shares the tale of Broomhilda, sparking Django's interest. Feeling a sense of duty to Django, Schultz admits he can't let him go to Greenville without helping him find Broomhilda. Schultz introduces Django to the idea of bounty hunting to earn money for her freedom. Django accepts Schultz's proposal to work together through the winter, with Django receiving a portion of the bounties once the snow melts. Schultz promises to assist Django in finding his wife in Greenville. The next day, they return to Texas and begin their first bounty mission, resulting in Django collecting his first reward and practicing his shooting skills. Throughout the winter, they accumulate multiple rewards, effortlessly taking down suspects. Their journey leads them to Mississippi, where they encounter numerous enslaved black individuals on the streets. Later, they discover that Broomhilda is now owned by Calvin J. Candy, the proprietor of the fourth largest cotton plantation in Mississippi known as Candyland. Feeling desperate, Schultz wonders how to rescue her from Calvin and proposes a different approach. Instead of purchasing a horse, they devise a plan to buy a farm. Schultz then suggests that Django pose as an expert Mandingo fighter, hired by a wealthy buyer from Dusseldorf in Greenville to enter the brutal fighting scene. Calvin is known for coercing his slaves into deadly Mandingo fights. Django and Schultz eventually meet Calvin at his upscale club as he watches the gruesome fights. Schultz tries to negotiate with Calvin to buy one of his top fighters as a pretext to acquiring Broomhilda at a minimal cost since Calvin refuses to sell her. Fortunately, they catch Calvin's attention and receive an invitation to Candyland. The next day, Schultz advises Django to keep his composure and not let revenge cloud his judgment if he hopes to reunite with his wife, who is at Candyland. On their way to the plantation, they encounter Calvin's slave trackers capturing D'Artagnan, an escaped Mandingo fighter, with their K-9 dogs. D'Artagnan begs Calvin, expressing his inability to continue fighting, but Calvin simply instructs D'Artagnan to come down and speak with him properly. Unfortunately, Calvin realizes that D'Artagnan has lost his latest match and proceeds to humiliate him by questioning his understanding of reimbursement. Feeling frustrated, Schultz tries to intervene by offering to reimburse D'Artagnan, but Django steps in to prevent Schultz from blowing their cover. Following this, Calvin pauses and approaches Django, inquiring if he would be willing to take charge of D'Artagnan, after which he orders the tracker dogs to attack D'Artagnan. Distraught, Schultz is left with no alternative but to witness D'Artagnan being mauled by the dogs. They then continue their journey to Candyland as if nothing had occurred in the forest. Suddenly, Stephen is taken aback upon seeing Django riding a horse alongside Schultz. Calvin then clarifies that Django is a free man and instructs him to treat them with respect. Subsequently, Schultz asks Calvin to help restore Broomhilda's reputation, as he wishes to meet her. However, Django overhears discussions about Broomhilda being mistreated, prompting him to almost draw his gun before realizing he must remain composed to secure his wife's release. Django is disheartened as he observes Broomhilda tearfully carrying out tasks, such as cleaning. That evening, Laura Lee brings Broomhilda to Schultz's quarters for a conversation. Schultz reminds Broomhilda that they will only converse in German, assuming that Calvin's enforcers may be listening in order to reveal their rescue plan to her. Later on, he solidifies his proposal to purchase her as his companion while he discusses the initial agreement over dinner. Perplexed, Broomhilda inquires about his associate's identity, prompting Django to eventually reveal himself to her. Subsequently, at dinner that night, Schultz begins to persuade Calvin to accept his offer when suddenly, Stephen, a fiercely loyal and suspicious headhouse slave of Calvin, recognizes that Broomhilda recognizes Django after witnessing her shocked reaction to Laura Lee's remarks about him. Sensing an opportunity, Stephen informs Calvin that he is not interested in acquiring Mandingo fighters, but rather wishes to obtain Broomhilda, causing Schultz and Django to realize their ruse as Calvin chooses to set a trap by acquiescing to the demand for Broomhilda. Fortunately, Laura Lee intervenes to rescue Broomhilda from Calvin and Stephen's ridicule, unwittingly helping Django maintain his composure as well. Responding to the situation, Calvin dismisses everyone else from the dining area to converse with Django, his attorney, and Schultz. Subsequently, he discloses their intention to purchase Broomhilda, commanding Stephen to bring her forth while exerting physical pressure on her neck. Regrettably, Calvin changes the terms of the agreement at gunpoint, opting to sell Broomhilda for $12,000 instead of the fighter Eskimo Joe. Despite Schultz's reluctant acceptance, when Calvin aggressively threatens to harm Broomhilda with a hammer, Schultz refuses to proceed with the deal. With no alternative, Schultz hands over the money promptly. Following this, they finalize their transaction and await Calvin to provide the necessary paperwork for Broomhilda. However, Schultz reaches his breaking point with Calvin's arrogance when Calvin threatens to kill Broomhilda if they don't shake hands, prompting Schultz to shoot Calvin dead. In response, Butch Pooch swiftly kills Schultz with his rifle. Django, fueled by rage, retaliates by shooting Butch Pooch, Calvin's lawyer, and several henchmen. Despite engaging in a gunfight, Django surrenders upon seeing Broomhilda taken hostage by Steven and Calvin's henchman, Billy Crash. The next day, Django, bound vertically, faces torture from Billy, who nearly castrates him. However, Steven interrupts, stating that Laura Lee wants to see Django. Fortunately, Laura Lee changes her mind about mutilating Django and decides to hand him over to the LeQuint Dickey Mining Company instead. With no other option, Laura Lee takes charge of the plantation, condemning Django to a slow death by selling him to the mining company. During the journey to his new owner, Django devises an escape plan by conversing with his escorts and offering them a share of the bounty if they believe his lies about wanted men being at Candyland. Thankfully, Django is freed by his escorts, convinced by him and his fellow enslaved men. Armed with rifles and dynamite, Django turns the tables on his guards, eliminating them. With dynamite in hand, he returns to Candyland on horseback, swiftly dispatching the trackers at their base and retrieving Broomhilda's freedom papers from Schultz's body in the barn. Django bids farewell to Schultz, planning to avenge him and D'Artagnan, who died from Calvin's slave dogs. He heads straight to the shelter where Broomhilda is held captive, seizing the opportunity to rescue her while Calvin's mourners are away. Under cover of night, Django eliminates Laura, Crash, and the remaining henchmen returning from Calvin's burial. He instructs the two remaining enslaved women to say goodbye to Laura Lee, but Steven tries to stop him from leaving. Having exacted his revenge, Django incapacitates Steven and triggers the dynamite he planted around the mansion, ignoring Steven's pleas. Django and Broomhilda watch as the manor explodes from a distance before riding off together on horseback. Django earns the nickname, the fastest gun in the South, as a result of his actions. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell if you want to watch more videos like this. Thank you for watching and see you again soon. Take care.